The courtroom was wrapped in silence. The judge sat upright, gavel in hand, while the audience leaned forward, anticipating the next words to be spoken. All eyes turned toward the witness stand, where a small figure sat. Isabella, an 8-year-old girl with deep brown eyes that held more emotion than most adults could express. Next to her, quietly sitting at attention, was Max, her loyal service dog. The tension was palpable. Then, with a calmness that defied the moment, Isabella leaned closer to Max, her lips barely moving as she whispered something into his ear. The room remained still, unsure of what to make of the moment. Max tilted his head, then stood and took 3 deliberate steps forward, turning to face the judge. He sat, tail still, gaze firm. Judge Ramirez raised an eyebrow. Then, without saying a word, he lifted his gavel and struck it once. The sound echoed through the courtroom. "Recess," he announced, effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the audience. Lawyers exchanged glances. No one seemed to understand, except perhaps the girl and her dog. This is the story of Isabella, a child whose voice was nearly lost to trauma, and Max, the dog who became her voice when the world wouldn't listen. Together, they changed the outcome of a case no one thought could be won. What did Isabella whisper to Max? What did the judge discover that brought the proceedings to a halt? Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth behind this incredible moment in court. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life tales that touch the heart and challenge the mind. The courtroom clock ticked softly, a faint reminder of time passing as the room settled into an unnatural quiet. Pale morning light streamed through high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The wooden benches creaked as observers shifted in anticipation. No one dared speak. At the center of it all sat Isabella, barely tall enough for her feet to touch the floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Next to her, Max, a golden retriever with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor, lay still. His presence was both grounding and mysterious. His vest identified him as a service animal, but there was something in the way he watched Isabella, alert, almost protective, that hinted at a deeper bond. Judge Ramirez, a tall man with silver at his temples and a reputation for fairness, surveyed the room. He had handled countless cases in his years on the bench, but something about this one felt different. The silence wasn't just procedural, it was loaded, like the room itself was holding its breath. At the prosecution's table sat Laura, Isabella's mother. Her posture was stiff, her fingers clenched around a tissue she hadn't used. Her eyes were locked on her daughter, with a mixture of concern and sorrow. On the opposite side sat Miguel, Isabella's father. His arms were folded across his chest, his jaw tight. He glanced at Max occasionally, a flicker of irritation in his expression. The custody case had drawn attention, not because of high-profile names or scandal, but because the central witness was a child who barely spoke, and a dog who seemed to understand everything she felt. The lawyers murmured to each other, shuffling papers, reviewing notes, but all of them, like the judge, kept stealing glances at the girl and her dog. "Isabella," Judge Ramirez said gently, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you feel comfortable speaking today?" Isabella didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on Max and her lips tightened. A moment passed, then 2. "She responds better with Max," her lawyer, Ms. Delgado, interjected softly. "He's trained to recognize her emotional states." Ramirez nodded, not unkindly. "We're in uncharted waters here, but if the dog helps, we'll allow it." Max lifted his head as if sensing the shift in energy. He nudged Isabella's hand with his nose. She turned to him slowly and leaned in. Her hair fell over her shoulder, shielding her face from view. Her lips moved. Max listened. Nothing about the moment was dramatic in action, but everyone in the room felt it. Like something important had just been set in motion, even if they couldn't see it yet. The judge tapped his pen against the desk, then looked toward the court reporter. "We'll proceed with caution. Let's allow the child to communicate in the way she needs to." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled among the attorneys. Outside, the city carried on with its routine noise, but inside that room the world had narrowed to one little girl, her dog, and a question no one yet knew how to ask. Miguel shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Laura flinched but said nothing. The judge heard it but didn't respond directly. Instead, he leaned forward and studied Isabella again. "Let's begin by understanding her story." As he spoke, Max placed one paw gently on Isabella's knee. Her breathing slowed. There was something in that stillness, Not silence from fear, but silence that held weight, like a truth waiting to surface. The first clue had arrived, but no one yet recognized it. Before the courtroom, before the silence, before the tension that clung to every breath, there was just Isabella and Max. Their story began not in the cold formality of a courthouse, but in a modest home tucked away in the suburbs. A home that once echoed with laughter, bedtime stories, and the gentle thump of Max's tail against the wooden floor. Isabella had always been a quiet child, sensitive to sounds, to moods, to things left unsaid. But everything changed when the arguments began. At first, it was just raised voices behind closed doors. Then came the slamming doors, the tense dinners, the tears her mother tried to hide. The once warm house grew cold, not in temperature but in feeling. Max entered her life during one of those long silences that followed a particularly bad night. A gift, her mother said, from a therapy program. But Max wasn't just a pet. He was specially trained to detect early signs of anxiety and distress in children. For Isabella, he became her anchor. At night, when shadows loomed larger than usual and her father's voice echoed in her memory, Max would curl up beside her, resting his chin on her chest, his weight calming her breathing. In the mornings, when she didn't want to face school or the world outside, Max nudged her gently, encouraging her to rise. He knew when she needed space and when she needed closeness. He knew sometimes better than she did. Laura, her mother, did her best. She enrolled Isabella in counseling, joined parenting groups, read every book on childhood trauma. But even she admitted that the most progress came from Max. He didn't need Isabella to explain how she felt, he just knew, and he responded in kind. The separation between Laura and Miguel had not been clean. There were accusations, nothing proven but enough tension to make shared custody a nightmare. Miguel insisted he loved his daughter, but Isabella's body told a different story whenever his name came up. Her shoulders tensed, her eyes clouded, and Max, ever alert, would place himself between her and whoever was asking questions. When the custody battle escalated, professionals were brought in to evaluate Isabella. Psychologists noted her emotional withdrawal, her aversion to verbal expression, and her exceptional response to Max. A specialist wrote, "It is clear that Max is not merely an emotional support animal. He is functionally an interpreter for Isabella's emotional state." Still, courts favored structure. They wanted words, statements, testimonies, and Isabella had none to give, at least not directly. So when the trial began and Isabella was asked to take the stand, it was Max who accompanied her. Some objected at first, but Laura insisted. So did the psychologist. And in the end, the judge agreed. That's how Isabella ended up in that chair, surrounded by adults who spoke in legal jargon, trying to make decisions that could alter her future, while she clung silently to the one being who had never asked her to explain herself. It was important to understand this. Isabella wasn't mute. She spoke when she felt safe. But in high-stress situations, her voice often failed her. Trauma, the therapist said. Anxiety layered over fear, layered over confusion. She was too young to understand it all, but Max helped bridge the gap. He could detect her anxiety before she could name it. He'd been trained to respond to changes in her heart rate, breathing, and posture. A subtle whine if she needed help, a paw on her lap to ground her, movement toward or away from a person, depending on her subconscious cues. Most people saw a dog. The court would soon see something much more, but for now, as the judge prepared to hear her story, it was crucial to understand the weight Isabella carried and how Max helped her bear it. Their bond wasn't just special, it was essential. The courtroom had never been a place of comfort, but for Isabella it felt especially foreign. The wooden benches, the echo of footsteps on polished tile, the low hum of whispered conversations, all of it felt too big, too loud. Max sat close by, his eyes scanning the room, his body alert but calm. At the front, Judge Ramirez called the session to order. His presence was firm, but not unkind. He looked first to Laura's attorney. "We'll begin with the petitioner," he said. Laura's lawyer, Ms. Alvarez, stood. Her tone was steady, professional. "Your Honor, we're here because my client, Laura Medina, is seeking full custody of her daughter, Isabella. She believes that shared custody with Mr. Miguel Duarte is no longer in the best interest of the child." Laura kept her gaze on the table in front of her, fingers tightening around her tissue once again. Miguel scoffed audibly. His attorney placed a calming hand on his shoulder. Alvarez continued. We have medical documentation, school reports, and psychological evaluations indicating that Isabella experiences significant emotional distress when in her father's care. Miguel leaned forward. That's a lie, he muttered, loud enough for several people to hear. Judge Ramirez raised a brow. You'll have your turn, Mr. Duarte. Miguel leaned back, arms crossed again. Then came the counter-argument. Miguel's lawyer, Mr. Calderon, presented a different picture. My client has consistently shown interest in being part of Isabella's life. He believes Laura is manipulating the situation, using the child's emotional struggles as a weapon against him. There is no concrete evidence of abuse, neglect, or any behavior that would warrant full custody being taken away. The words were measured, but Miguel's expression betrayed his frustration. They're trying to erase me from her life, he said. Ramirez sighed. Mr. Duarte. Miguel fell silent, though his jaw remained clenched. Isabella sat motionless through it all. The adults debated her fate as if she weren't in the room, but Max felt it, the way her breathing changed, the way her hands trembled slightly on the armrest. He shifted closer, pressing gently against her leg. Your Honor, Ms. Alvarez said, we believe Isabella may be able to offer insight even if limited. With the court's permission, we'd like her to communicate through her service dog, Max. That drew murmurs from the observers. Calderon stood, objecting. This is highly unorthodox. We can't allow testimony through an animal, but the judge didn't dismiss the idea outright. He glanced toward Isabella, then toward Max, who now had his chin resting gently on her lap. I've reviewed the psychological evaluations, Ramirez said. They make a strong case for Max's role in Isabella's emotional regulation. I'm willing to allow it, on a trial basis. Let's see how it unfolds. The murmurs grew louder, but the judge's gavel brought instant silence. Ms. Medina, he said, turning to Laura, can you tell us when Isabella's communication with Max became essential? Laura nodded. Shortly after Miguel moved out, she began having panic attacks. She wouldn't speak, not to me, not to anyone. Max, he was the only one she responded to. He calms her, but more than that, he senses her. She's told me more through Max than she ever could on her own. Ramirez turned to Isabella. Young lady, I know this is difficult, but if you'd like to share something today, we'll listen. However you feel safe doing it. Isabella didn't look up, but she placed her hand on Max's head. Slowly, her fingers moved through his fur. Then she leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear. No one could hear the words, but Max reacted immediately. He turned his head, looked directly at Judge Ramirez, and let out a low, quiet whine. The room froze. It wasn't noise, it was message. And for the first time, Miguel looked unsure. The room remained still, caught in the aftermath of Max's soft whine. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Judge Ramirez watched the dog intently, not as a skeptic, but as someone trying to understand a language foreign yet undeniably purposeful. Ms. Delgado, Isabella's attorney, rose slowly. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to explain how Max communicates on Isabella's behalf. Ramirez nodded, eyes still on Max. Proceed. Max is trained in deep emotional recognition, she began. He was part of a pilot program that goes beyond service animals' standard anxiety detection. He responds to specific emotional cues, even ones the child may not be consciously aware of. Each type of response, whining, nudging, sitting between people, has been observed and categorized. He doesn't interpret her words, but her emotional truth. He responds when Isabella feels something deeply, especially fear or distress. Miguel shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Ms. Delgado continued, what we just witnessed, Isabella whispering to Max, followed by his response, is something we've seen many times in therapy. She expresses herself through him. It's not magic, it's trust, and it's repeatable. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Isabella, he said gently, would you feel safe enough to tell Max something again? Something about how you feel today? She didn't respond at first. Max turned his head toward her, nudged her hand once, and waited. Slowly, she leaned forward. Her lips moved again, almost imperceptibly. This time Max stood. He didn't bark or growl. Instead, he walked slowly but deliberately across the courtroom toward Laura. He sat beside her, facing the judge. The room held its breath. What does that mean? Calderon asked, a note of frustration in his voice. Ms. Delgado answered, that Isabella feels safe with her mother. Max always places himself where she feels secure, or where she wants to be. Ramirez looked over at Miguel. "And when she's with her father?" "She shuts down," Laura said quietly. No movement, no words, no expression. Max stays between them. The judge turned his attention back to Max, then to Isabella. "May I ask you one more thing, Isabella?" She looked up briefly, just enough to show she was listening. "If you feel scared or unsure, can you tell Max?" She nodded, the movement barely noticeable. "Then please," the judge said, "let him know." Isabella closed her eyes. Max, still by Laura's side, stood up and walked across the room, this time toward Miguel. He didn't get too close. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and stood between Isabella and her father, his body stiff. The courtroom fell silent again. It was a message, clear, unspoken, but powerful. Miguel's lawyer tried to recover. "With respect, Your Honor, we're assigning human meaning to animal behavior." Ms. Delgado shook her head. "It's not speculation. We have a record, over a dozen instances, documented by therapists and educators. Max's behavior is consistent and mirrors Isabella's emotional state every time." Ramirez didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Isabella, then Max, then the space between them. Finally, he said, "This court recognizes traditional testimony, but in special circumstances we must look deeper into behavior, patterns, context. Isabella may not speak with her mouth today, but she's speaking, loudly." The spectators exchanged looks, some with curiosity, others with empathy, a few like Miguel with growing unease. Laura reached out slowly and placed a hand on Max's head. He relaxed under her touch. Isabella exhaled softly. Her small shoulders lowered just a bit, the first visible sign of release since the trial began. The judge picked up his pen and made a note. This case, it seemed, wouldn't be decided solely by legal arguments or evidence exhibits, but by trust, by the unspoken language of a child and her dog. The courtroom had never seen anything like it. And something told everyone present. They were only just beginning to understand what Max was about to reveal. The stillness in the courtroom deepened. No one dared break the silence after Max's last move. Even Miguel, who had entered the room with bravado, now sat with his eyes narrowed, watching the dog with a flicker of uncertainty. Something in the air had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Judge Ramirez adjusted his glasses and spoke softly, almost as if not to disturb the fragile balance that had taken hold. "I want to proceed with caution," he said. "What we're witnessing is unusual, yes, but it's consistent, and it's real." He turned to Isabella. "Would you like to share more through Max?" She didn't move, but Max did. The golden retriever walked slowly, this time not toward either parent. Instead, he returned to Isabella's side, sitting at attention. Then, without command, he let out a soft, throaty growl, not menacing, but firm, protective. Gasps echoed, murmurs rose. Miguel leaned forward. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, almost laughing, though the edge in his voice betrayed discomfort. Ramirez didn't answer immediately. He watched Max carefully, then looked to Ms. Delgado. "Is this part of his training?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. That sound is one of his learned responses. It signals distress or fear, not his own but Isabella's. He only growls when she feels threatened. Miguel shot up. "She's not threatened. This is manipulation, this whole thing." "Mr. Duarte, sit down," Ramirez ordered firmly. Miguel hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat, fists clenched. Max didn't take his eyes off him. Then something unexpected happened. Max stood again and walked directly toward Miguel, but this time he didn't stop at a safe distance. He walked closer and closer, until he was directly in front of him. Miguel froze. Max sat and stared, not aggressively but intently, as if waiting. The judge raised his hand, signaling everyone to remain silent. Then Max turned, looked at Isabella, and let out a soft, almost pleading whine. Isabella's eyes welled with tears. She covered her face with her hands and shook her head. "Your Honor," Laura said quietly, "I think she wants to say something. But she can't, not without him." The judge nodded. "Then let's give her space." The courtroom was cleared. Only essential personnel remained. The judge, both parents, their attorneys, and the child with her dog. "Isabella," Ramirez said gently, "we're going to listen. However you want to speak." Max returned to her side, brushing against her legs. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. For a long moment she stayed that way. Then, Slowly, she lifted her head. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Max knows." Those two words fell like stones into water, sending invisible ripples across the room. Miguel looked startled. Laura covered her mouth. Ramirez leaned in. "Knows what, Isabella?" She shook her head. "I can't say it, but Max can show you." The judge glanced at Max again. "Then we'll watch him." He gestured to the bailiff to open the side door. A staff member entered, carrying a set of Isabella's drawings, crayons on paper collected during her counseling sessions. The psychologist had submitted them as emotional insight exhibits. Isabella pointed to the pile. "Let Max pick." One by one, the drawings were laid out across a table. Max approached slowly, nose twitching as he sniffed the air. He moved deliberately, ignoring some, hovering near others. Finally, he stopped at one. It showed a small figure sitting in a dark room, eyes wide, with a much larger figure standing in the doorway. The shadow loomed across the floor. In the corner of the picture, a small golden dog sat, looking up. Max sat. Everyone stared. Judge Ramirez spoke. "What does this drawing mean, Isabella?" She looked at her father, then back at the drawing. "That's when I needed Max the most." For the first time, Miguel looked shaken. His eyes flicked between his daughter, the drawing, and the dog who refused to leave his spot. It was no longer just a custody case. It was becoming something else, and the truth was clawing its way to the surface, guided not by a voice, but by the unwavering eyes of a dog who knew too much. The drawing sat in the center of the table like a silent witness. It spoke no words, yet said everything. The longer people looked at it, the heavier the air became. Max remained motionless, his gaze steady on Miguel, who had gone pale. Judge Ramirez cleared his throat. "Isabella, can you tell us, who is the figure in the doorway?" She hesitated. Her lips trembled and her hands clutched Max's fur tightly. Then, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "Papi, when he gets mad." Miguel shook his head quickly. "No, that's not..." She's confused. "That's not what happened. She's exaggerating." But Max growled again, not loudly but low and sharp. The sound stopped Miguel mid-sentence. The judge turned to Ms. Delgado. "Is this typical?" She nodded. "Max doesn't growl often, only when Isabella feels unsafe or when her fear becomes acute. His response is instinctive but backed by training." Laura reached out, placing a steadying hand on Isabella's shoulder. The little girl leaned into her mother's touch. "I didn't know it was wrong," Isabella said, her voice shaking. "He didn't hit me, not really, but he yelled a lot, and sometimes he grabbed my arms too hard, and he broke things." Her voice cracked. Max responded immediately, nuzzling her side and licking her hand. The tension in her shoulders softened ever so slightly. "He said it was my fault when he got angry," she continued. "He said I was too sensitive, that I made everything harder." Miguel stood abruptly. "This is a setup. She's 8 years old. You can't base a legal decision on a child's fear of discipline." The judge didn't respond to the outburst. Instead, he looked back at Isabella. "Is that when Max started staying close to you?" She nodded. "He sleeps at my door. He never lets me be alone with Papi unless Mama is home." Ramirez glanced at Ms. Alvarez, Laura's attorney. "Were these claims presented in the original custody evaluation?" Alvarez shook her head. "No, Your Honor. Isabella was too afraid to speak during the sessions. The evaluators noted her withdrawal but didn't have details. This is the first time she's voiced it, through Max and now directly." Miguel was visibly sweating now. His hands trembled slightly as he sat back down. Ramirez tapped his pen slowly against the desk. "Mr. Duarte, do you deny ever yelling, breaking things, or grabbing your daughter?" Miguel hesitated. I was under stress. Work, the separation. It wasn't abusive. I never laid a hand on her to hurt her. But you frightened her," the judge said calmly, "enough that she needed a dog to feel safe in your presence." Miguel's silence spoke louder than words. Then Max did something unexpected. He walked toward Laura and Isabella, sat beside them and placed both paws on the bench. He nudged Isabella, who looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Do you want to say anything else?" Ramirez asked her gently. Isabella looked at the judge, then at her father. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I don't want to hate him," she said, "but I'm scared when he's mad. Max knows when I'm scared, even when I try to hide it." Her words echoed in the quiet courtroom. Laura wiped her daughter's tears, holding her close. Ramirez leaned back in his chair. We ask children to speak in courtrooms not built for their voices, but today this child has spoken more clearly than many adults. He paused, turning to both attorneys. I believe we have enough to proceed. I will take a short recess to finalize my notes before issuing a ruling. The gavel struck once, signaling the break, but no one moved. Miguel sat frozen, absorbing the gravity of what had just unfolded. Isabella reached down and hugged Max tightly, and for the first time in a long time she didn't look afraid. The courtroom slowly filled again after the recess. The atmosphere was different now, thicker, heavier, as if everyone knew the decision to come would mark more than just a change in custody. It would redefine a family. Judge Ramirez returned to his bench and took a long moment before speaking. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on Isabella, who now sat quietly between Laura and Max, her hand resting gently on the dog's back. Before I give my ruling, he began, I want to make one thing clear. This case is not about assigning blame out of anger, but about protecting the emotional and psychological well-being of a child. That must remain our priority. Miguel sat still, but his fingers tapped nervously against his knee. His jaw worked side to side, as though grinding words he wasn't allowed to say. I have reviewed the submitted reports, the judge continued. But what I witnessed today, the interactions between Isabella and Max and the child's gradual willingness to express herself, carries substantial weight. Her truth was evident in her body language, her responses, and most notably in her bond with her service animal. He turned slightly toward Miguel. Mr. Duarte, I do not believe you intended to harm your daughter, but intentions are not the same as impact. What matters is how your presence affects her. Right now, Isabella associates you with fear. That is not an opinion. It is a fact reinforced by her words, her behavior, and her service dog's consistent reactions. Miguel leaned forward, visibly tense. You're taking her away from me based on a dog's behavior? No, Ramirez replied firmly. I'm making a ruling based on a child's trauma and the extraordinary way she managed to communicate it with Max's help. Miguel scoffed, shaking his head. This is outrageous. Then, without warning, he stood. This whole thing is biased. You all decided this before we walked in. My daughter's scared because Laura poisoned her against me. Gasps rose from the audience. The bailiff moved closer, but the judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Duarte. Miguel hesitated, then dropped back into his chair, seething. And just then, Max stood. Once again, he placed himself between Isabella and her father, but this time he growled, not low and cautious, but deep and warning. A sound that silenced even Miguel. The judge's voice was calm, but now laced with finality. That reaction tells me more than any psychologist's report ever could. He reached for the folder in front of him and opened it. I hereby grant full legal and physical custody of Isabella Medina to her mother, Laura Medina, Mr. Duarte will have no visitation rights at this time. Miguel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Future contact, the judge continued, may only be reconsidered upon court-ordered therapy, anger management, and a complete psychological evaluation. This is not permanent, Mr. Duarte, but your daughter deserves to heal without fear. Tears rolled silently down Laura's cheeks. She pulled Isabella close, and Max, sensing the release of tension, laid his head on the child's lap, eyes closing as if satisfied that his duty, for now, was complete. The courtroom remained hushed. Ramirez placed the gavel down, not slamming it this time, but resting it with care. This hearing is adjourned. People began to rise, papers rustling, shoes echoing on the tile. Miguel stayed seated, staring blankly ahead. Whatever argument he had prepared was now gone. Laura stood, taking Isabella's hand. The girl clung to Max's leash with her other hand. Together they began walking toward the exit. But just before leaving, Isabella stopped. She turned her head slowly toward her father. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the room held its breath. I don't hate you, she said softly. I just need to feel safe. Miguel's eyes shimmered, but he didn't speak. Max nudged Isabella gently forward, and together they walked out. The courtroom doors closed behind Laura, Isabella, and Max, leaving the buzz of the audience behind them. In the halls of the courthouse, the tension was replaced by a strange sense of relief. The worst was over, but for Isabella it was just the beginning of a new chapter. As they walked out into the fresh air, Laura wrapped her arm around Isabella's shoulders. Max trotted beside them, his head high, as if proud of the role he'd played in this strange, unspoken journey. Isabella, however, still seemed small, her steps slow, as if she was carrying an invisible weight. Laura could feel it, the child's exhaustion, her need for quiet after the storm of emotions that had passed through the courtroom. "I know today was hard," Laura said softly, her voice calm and comforting. "But you did it. You told your truth." Isabella nodded, but her eyes were distant. She wasn't quite ready to let go of the feelings she had held back for so long. The feelings that only Max had been able to fully understand. Max, sensing her unease, sat down and looked up at her, offering a quiet reassurance. "I know you don't understand everything that happened today," Laura continued, "but what I want you to know is this. You're safe now. You're always safe with me." Isabella sniffled and wiped her eyes. I don't want him to be mad anymore. I want to forget what it felt like when he yelled." Laura kissed her daughter's forehead. "You don't have to forget, honey, but you do get to choose how you live now, and you get to choose how you feel. No one can take that from you." Max stood up, walking ahead for a few paces before turning to look back at Isabella, his eyes soft yet steady. He seemed to guide her with the same gentle persistence that had carried her through the darkest moments. She had learned in the end that Max wasn't just her protector, he was her voice when words failed. Isabella smiled faintly. "I feel better with him, Mum. I think he's the only one who really knows me." Laura nodded. "I know, sweetie. He's a very special dog." As they reached the car, Laura opened the door for Isabella and helped her into the back seat. Max hopped in beside her, curling up in the space between them, as if ensuring that the bond they shared wouldn't be broken by anything. The drive home was quiet, but the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Isabella looked out the window, her thoughts far away. She had a long way to go, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had Max and her mother, who would always protect her no matter what. Back at home, they settled into a new routine. Laura made dinner while Isabella and Max played in the living room. It wasn't a perfect world. The scars left by the past would take time to heal, but every moment of peace was a small victory. That evening, as Isabella got ready for bed, she paused before she turned off the light. "Mum," she called softly. "Yes, sweetie. I think I'm ready to talk to him again." Laura smiled, her heart swelling with love and relief. "You'll be ready when you're ready, darling." "There's no rush," Isabella smiled, then whispered to Max, "We're okay now, aren't we?" Max looked up at her with eyes full of understanding. He wagged his tail once and then lay down, resting his head on her feet. The story of Isabella and Max had come full circle, but it was far from the end. In their quiet world, they would continue to rebuild, one day at a time, with a bond forged in silence, trust, and the unspoken understanding that they would always be there for each other. And as the night settled in, with the soft hum of the house around them, Isabella fell asleep, finally at peace, no longer afraid of the dark.